12 winters had passed since Thorn Shepherd last heard a human voice. 12 years since he'd buried the world behind canyon walls, so steep and remote, even the birds seemed to avoid them. His cabin, tucked like a secret into the red stone, stood silent in the pre-dawn hush, a fortress built not from logs and mortar, but from grief and the stubborn will to disappear. The fire crackled softly inside. Outside, the air hung heavy with mountain mist, clinging to the rocks like breath frozen in place. Thorn stood barefoot on the creaky pine floor, one hand wrapped around a chipped enamel mug of bitter coffee, the other tugging his coat tighter against the chill. His mind, as always, was still blank, waiting, surviving. Then came the knock. Soft, uncertain. It was the kind of sound a man imagined after too many years alone, the whisper of memory not real. He didn't move, then again, fainter, slower, a brush of knuckles barely tapping wood. He froze mid-step coffee halfway to his lips, the steam rising like a question in the air. No one knew this place. He'd made damn sure of that. No trails led here, no maps marked it. And the last person who'd tried to follow him had given up halfway through the pass or died in the attempt. His heart didn't pound, it clenched. Silence returned longer this time. It stretched through the fog like a wire pulled tight, humming with tension. He waited. Maybe it was the wind, maybe another knock, even weaker, barely audible, desperate. He set the mug down gently, as if afraid sound alone might trigger something. His boots were already near the door. His rifle hung above the hearth, its stock worn smooth from old ghosts. He reached for it, fingers trembling, not from fear, but something more fragile. A memory. 12 years without another soul. And now this. He moved quietly to the window, stepping into the narrow beam of cold gray light, cutting across the floorboards. Pulling back the worn curtain just enough to see, he peered outside. There, slumped against the door frame, barely upright, was a figure. Long black hair matted with dust and blood, a buckskin dress torn in too many places. The fragile body leaned as if the door were the only thing holding her up. A woman, Apache, and dying. For a long moment he didn't move. The smart thing would be to wait. Let her collapse where she stood. Let the mountains take her as they took all things eventually. That's what the old Thorn would have done. The one who'd learned that helping only led to betrayal. That kindness was weakness, and weakness got you gutted. But the sound of that knock, so weak, so hopeless, had cracked something. Something he'd thought long buried under the stones of his exile. He unlatched the door, and she fell, into his arms, a tumble of limbs and blood and buckskin. She didn't cry out. Her body simply gave way, surrendering to gravity and pain, and something deeper, something that had carried her across this wilderness just to reach him. Thorn caught her before she hit the floor. She was warm, barely. Her breath fluttered like the wings of a dying bird, her skin an olive hue, now pale and slick, with sweat stuck to his shirt. He should have let her drop, should have stepped back and closed the door. But instead he stood frozen, holding this stranger, whose presence made every instinct scream, and yet every bone in his body refused to let go. This was no warrior, not now. No threat. This was someone's daughter. Bleeding on his doorstep, he stepped back into the cabin, cradling her gently as if afraid she'd vanish. The door swung shut behind him with a hollow thud. 12 years of silence, broken by a knock, and everything was about to change. Thorn laid her on the bed like she was made of glass, fragile, foreign, and entirely too real. His calloused hands trembled as he stepped back, watching crimson seep through the torn leather of her dress and stain his woolen blanket. He had dressed wounds before on himself, on animals, had sewn skin with fishing line and whiskey. But this was different. This was a woman. And not just any woman, but Apache. Every story he'd ever heard came rushing back. Warriors who slit throats under moonlight, women who poisoned water wells with a smile. Savages, they'd said, merciless, vengeful, untamable. But lying there in his bed, half-conscious, breathing shallow and uneven, this woman looked nothing like a threat. She looked like a dying prayer. He moved mechanically, setting water to boil, rummaging through cabinets for the old tin box that passed as his medical kit, mostly cloth rags and alcohol, too bitter for even him to drink. He wasn't thinking, not really, just acting. The air in the cabin was thick with the smell of blood and wood smoke, and something else, fear maybe, or the faintest trace of lilac clinging to her skin beneath the iron tang of her wound. As he approached with a basin of hot water, her eyes fluttered open, dark, endless, sharp as obsidian. They locked on him instantly. No panic, no confusion, just silent appraisal as if she were seeing straight through the layers of stubble grime and solitude into whatever soul he had left. She tried to sit up. A wince of pain crossed her face and she fell back, biting down on the cry that almost escaped her lips. "Easy," he said, voice rough like gravel, unused to shaping words. "You're hurt bad." She didn't respond right away, just stared. Then finally, with the effort of someone pushing through water, she spoke. "You are not what I expected to find." The words struck him like a slap. What had she expected? A wild-eyed hermit, a killer. Maybe he was all those things. Maybe he'd just forgotten. He cleared his throat suddenly, self-conscious under her gaze. "Neither are you," he muttered. A ghost of a smile touched her lips, tired, bitter, almost amused, before pain chased it away. "I am Ayana," she whispered. "And you are the ghost man the elders speak of. The one who vanished into the mountains and never came back." His breath caught. If the Apache had stories about him, then he wasn't as invisible as he'd thought. That meant others could find him too. He'd spent 12 years erasing himself, only to be summoned back to the world by the woman bleeding in his bed. But her next words froze him cold. "They say you lost someone. That grief turned you into a shadow." The statement carried no judgment, just knowledge, as if she knew the shape of pain from the inside. Thorne looked away, jaw clenched. He didn't respond, didn't need to. She reached out, weak but deliberate, and gripped his wrist as he moved to examine her wound. Her fingers were warm, firm grounding. "Before you decide to help me," she said, her voice barely above a breath, "you should know that helping me will bring them here, and they won't ask questions." He stared down at her. Her face was strong, even in exhaustion, cheekbones carved from stone, mouth tight with pride. She wasn't pleading. She was warning him, giving him a way out. But he already knew. He'd known the moment she collapsed into his arms. "I'll patch you up," he said, pulling gently free of her grasp. "Then we'll see." As he peeled back the layers of her dress, the gash along her ribs came into view, deep, ugly, the kind of wound made by steel and hate. It would need cleaning pressure time, but it wasn't fatal. Not yet. He soaked the cloth in hot water, the steam rising between them like smoke from a battlefield, and tried not to think about how his world had changed the moment she knocked. Ayana closed her eyes, exhaling slowly, trusting him without saying the word. And that trust, quiet, undeserved, dangerous, shook him more than any threat ever had. The light in the cabin had shifted by the time her voice broke the silence again. It was dusk now, gold slipping into ash, the shadows stretching long across the floor. Thorne sat near the hearth hands, still stained from cleaning her wound, his mind a hurricane of questions he wasn't ready to ask. Ayana's breath had steadied, though her skin was still pale, her body curled beneath a rough woolen blanket like a flame struggling to stay lit. Her eyes opened dark as midnight and found him instantly. "You didn't ask who I am," she said. "I figured you'd tell me when it mattered." It matters now. He didn't move, just waited. My father was Chief Nalnish. The name landed like a bullet. Thorn had heard it in whispers across frontier saloons and military tents. Nalnish, strategist, leader ghost in the rocks. The Apache war chief who refused to bow, who turned every attempt at negotiation into a bloody lesson in why his people would never be caged. If she was his daughter, then this wasn't just a wounded girl on the run. This was the flame at the center of a powder keg. Thorn stood slowly rubbing the back of his neck like he could scrub away the implications. "You shouldn't be here," he said. Not cruelly, just truth. "I didn't choose your door. I chose not to die in the river." Her voice was low, but each word cut clean. He looked down at her, torn. "If they find you here—" "They will," she interrupted. "They were close when I broke from the hills. White men, uniforms without honor, soldiers, bounty hunters I don't know anymore. They attacked before sunrise, killed the children first." Her voice didn't break. It was worse than that. It didn't even try. "I was gathering herbs near the river," she continued. "I heard the screams. When I reached the camp, they were already lighting fires." She closed her eyes for a breath, then reopened them steady as ever. "They're not looking for a prisoner. They're hunting a message." Thorn crossed the room to the table, poured himself a shot of whiskey with a hand that wasn't as steady as he wished. He downed it in one burning swallow. "You knew what bringing this here would mean," he said finally. "I knew it might be the only way I lived long enough to warn someone." He turned to her, expression hard. "Warn who? The world's already decided who your people are." "Then I came to the right place," she said. "Because you decided to disappear too." The words hit harder than any accusation. Because there was no accusation, just understanding. He'd built this cabin like a tomb, not to hide from others, but from himself. "I'm not your savior," he said. "No," she agreed. "You're a man with nothing left to lose." That stopped him cold. She wasn't wrong, but hearing it aloud cracked something open. He moved toward her, slowly, crouching beside the bed again, gently lifting the edge of the bandage to check for fresh bleeding. Her hand caught his wrist before he could touch it, that same electricity as before. Her grip was firm, though her body trembled. "You can still let me go," she said. "Drag me outside, close the door, forget. They'd never know you helped." He met her gaze, steady now, though a storm still raged behind his eyes. "That's not who I am." "No," she said, "but it's who you were trying to be." For a long moment, neither spoke. The fire cracked softly. The wind whistled outside, chasing dusk across the canyon. And somewhere in the distance, maybe imagined, maybe not, hooves echoed against stone. The first sound was distant, barely more than a tremor carried on the wind, but Thorn heard it. Hoofbeats. 3 riders, maybe 4, pacing slow and careful through the canyon. Not the thunder of a cavalry charge. The deliberate rhythm of men who knew how to track. His hand went to the window instinctively. The mist had lifted just enough to make out silhouettes against the red rock. Riders, just as he feared. Their horses picked along the narrow trail with the precision of bloodhounds. No hurry, no need. The trail they followed was already written in blood. Ayanna stirred behind him, trying to rise. He turned sharply. "Don't. They've found my scent," she whispered. "If they see your cabin, they'll assume they'll do more than assume." He moved quickly, silently. The hearth's fire still smoldered low. He crossed to it, pulled at the iron hook, embedded in the stone. A soft click. The panel beside the fireplace shifted slightly. Behind it, a root cellar no wider than a coffin carved into the rock, years ago not for survival, but for hiding. "Get in," he said. She didn't move. "You don't have to. Do it." Ayanna pushed herself upright, wincing but silent. He helped her across the room, one arm around her waist, the other clearing the path. As she stepped into the shadowed hollow, she paused, her face inches from his. "You would risk your life for me." Thorn's jaw flexed. The answer lay heavy in his chest, but he didn't speak it. Instead, he closed the panel, sealing her inside. Then he turned to the room and froze. Blood. Drops of it trailed from the door to the bed to the hearth. The basin of stained water sat on the table, a bundle of bloody rags nearby. The bed still soaked through with her wound. In his rush to save her, he had forgotten the one thing that kept him alive all these years, erasing the signs. Too late. The knock on the door was not weak this time. It came heavy, confident. "Territorial business," a voice barked. "Open up." Thorn took one breath, then another. Then he pulled the door open with a scowl carved deep into his face. "You boys lost." 3 men stood there, all armed, all smiling like jackals. The one in front wore a tarnished badge that looked more like an ornament than authority. His eyes were pale, calculating. "Deputy Marshal Clayton Briggs," he said. "We're tracking an Apache fugitive. Blood trail led us to your front porch." Thorn glanced down. Crimson drops shone like shame on the wooden boards. "Found a deer," he said flatly. "Arrow in its side. Damn thing bled halfway through the woods before I finished the job." The second man, broad and mean-looking, stepped forward. "Mind if we take a look?" Thorn didn't flinch. "Make it quick." He stepped aside, letting them enter. His cabin, once sanctuary, was now a trap. They moved like predators' eyes, drinking in every corner, every darkened edge. Briggs went straight for the basin, dipped a finger into the water, held it up. "Messy job," he murmured. "Hoof kicked me during dressing," Thorn said, rolling up his sleeve to reveal an old scar. "Split my arm open. Had to patch it before the meat spoiled." The third man said nothing. He crouched by the fireplace, dragging a gloved finger along the stone. When he stood, his eyes locked with Thorn's. His finger was red. He tilted his head. "This blood's fresh. Trail leads straight here. Something's off." Briggs smiled thinly. "You know what Apache blood's worth, Mr. $50. Alive. Less if they're dead, but still warm." Thorn's gut twisted. Not in fear, something colder. Deeper. "You boys always value life in dollars?" he asked. Briggs chuckled. "Apache ain't people. They're problems." The third man stepped closer to the hearth. His hand brushed the panel. Ayanna was inches away on the other side. "I wouldn't do that," Thorn said. "Why not?" the big one asked. "Got something to hide?" Thorn's voice dropped. "Only the past." But the silence that followed wasn't silence at all. In the stillness there was a sound, barely audible, a breath, a tremor, a heartbeat from behind the wall. The man froze. "There," he whispered. "Something's behind this wall." Briggs stepped forward, his smile curling with triumph. "Well, well. Looks like our mountain ghost has a secret after all." Thorn's pulse was steady, but the air in the room had shifted. Something raw stirred beneath his skin. Briggs's men were now fully alert, their hands brushing their holsters, the gleam in their eyes shifting from suspicion to certainty. The one near the hearth was tapping along the stones, methodical patient following the faint line of blood that led to the hidden panel. Thorn knew it was only seconds before they found the latch. He also knew what that meant. No more time, no more hiding. 12 years of silence about to end in fire and blood. "You want to know what's behind that wall," Thorn said, his voice calm, too calm. All 3 turned toward him. "You're about to find out why I really came to these mountains." Briggs narrowed his eyes. "What the hell does that mean?" "It means you made a mistake," Thorn said, taking a step forward, slow and controlled, like a man waking something long buried. "You thought I was hiding because I was afraid of fighting. You thought I was just some broken old hermit clinging to the last scraps of a coward's life. He reached up, unbuckling the knife at his belt with one fluid motion and setting it on the table, not threatening but not innocent either. 12 years ago, I was Captain Thorne Shepard, 5th Cavalry, until my entire unit was slaughtered because men like you sold positions and maps for gold. I buried every last one of them. Then I hunted the bastards who did it. Briggs snorted, but the laugh didn't reach his eyes. You're bluffing? Check the records, Thorne replied. Assuming you live long enough. The man at the hearth paused, mid-motion, eyes darting between Thorne and the panel. Something about the way Thorne stood there now, quiet, straight-backed eyes cold, as Riverstone made him hesitate. The third man, who'd been overturning chairs, stopped moving entirely. Jesus, he whispered. He's the ghost captain. Briggs's jaw clenched. You're outnumbered. Depends on the men, Thorne said. Silence held for a heartbeat too long. Then the man by the hearth found the latch. A soft click and the panel swung open. Ayanna, cramped inside, blood drying along her side eyes, sharp with fear and defiance. She didn't move, didn't cry out, just stared at them. Briggs' expression twisted. There she is, he breathed. $50 of Apache princess. He stepped forward. Thorne moved. It was like watching a storm collapse inward. One moment the cabin was still. The next, Thorne was across the room, knife in hand. Briggs tried to draw, but Thorne was already inside his reach. The blade slid under the ribcage, up and in, fast and final. Briggs's breath caught as he crumpled silently. The broad man by the hearth reached for his gun too late. Thorne's fist crushed his throat with a brutal upward blow. He fell, gasping, eyes wide, fingers clawing at his neck. The last one managed to draw, got the barrel up, but Thorne spun, let the shot graze past his shoulder, and drove into him with a savage efficiency honed in another life. The man staggered, hit the wall, slid down, bleeding from somewhere fatal. And just like that, it was over. The cabin fell quiet again, except now the silence wasn't peaceful. It was absolute. 3 bodies, 3 weapons, 3 mistakes. Thorne stood over them, breathing controlled, eyes dark. Ayanna emerged slowly from the wall, favoring her wounded side gaze, sweeping the room. So the stories were true, she said quietly. The ghost captain who vanished into the mountains. I tried to bury him here, Thorne replied, wiping the blade clean. But you can't bury what still breathes. The cabin stank of blood and gunpowder, not fresh blood, old blood waking from sleep. The kind that stained not just wood, but memory. Thorne stood still, blade in hand, surrounded by bodies cooling fast on his floor. Briggs had died without finishing his breath. The others followed close behind, their pistols, now useless weight. Outside, the canyon walls echoed with silence, as if the mountains themselves were holding their breath. Ayanna stepped out from the narrow crawl space, one hand pressed to her ribs, her steps slow but steady. Her eyes didn't flinch at the sight of the carnage. She didn't ask if it had been necessary. She didn't look afraid. She looked certain of what Thorne didn't know. He watched her take it in the broken furniture, the blood pooled beneath the hearth, the bodies slumped like fallen timber. Her gaze finally settled on him. So that's who you were, she said, voice low. The man they feared more than the war itself. Thorne looked at his hands, still wet, still shaking. Not with weakness, but with recognition. I didn't want to be him again, he muttered. But you were never not him, she replied. You just buried him under silence. He turned away, unsure what stung more, her words or their truth. For 12 years he'd believed that solitude was redemption, that erasing himself from the world could somehow erase what he'd done in it. But now the ghosts had returned and they'd brought a mirror. Ayanna moved closer. Her voice softened. You saved me. I killed for you, he corrected. You killed for justice, she said. There's a difference. He wasn't sure he believed that, but the way she said it made him want to try. She stepped carefully around the blood toward the bed, easing herself down with a quiet exhale. He moved to help her without thinking, then hesitated, hands still stained. She noticed and, without a word, reached out and placed her fingers over his. Not to clean them, just to say she wasn't afraid. For a long moment neither spoke. The fire crackled low. The wind returned, brushing against the walls like it too was uncertain what came next. They'll send more, Ayanna said finally. Men like these don't vanish without someone asking questions. Thorn nodded. Then we can't stay here. She looked up, meeting his eyes. Where would we go? There are caves, he said, deeper than this canyon, places your people used before the war began. No trail, no map, just stone and sky. The word hung in the air, fragile and bold. You want me to leave you behind? He asked. No, she said, and the answer came too quickly, too clearly. But you've already sacrificed your sanctuary. You don't owe me more. Thorn stared at her for a long time, then shook his head. I don't think this is about owing anymore. Something softened in her then. Not weakness, never weakness, but recognition that she too had been carrying weight too long alone. He looked around the cabin at the rifles, the stained wood, the empty bottles lining the shelf. 12 years of hiding, of surviving, not living, of pretending the man he used to be had died with the war. And now, because of a single knock, all of it was gone. Burned to ash in the space of a morning. Ayanna's hand was still on his. Steady. Present. Real. And for the first time in a decade, Thorn didn't feel like a ghost. The sun reached its peak as Thorn lashed the last saddlebag to his horse. Smoke still lingered faintly in the cabin's rafters, a reminder of everything that had just burned, not by flame, but by blood and choice. The floor was scrubbed as best it could be, but no amount of washing would cleanse what had happened here. The place no longer felt like a fortress. It felt like a grave. Ayanna stood in the doorway, cloak wrapped loosely around her shoulders, eyes scanning the canyon as if committing it to memory. Her side still ached, but she moved with that same quiet defiance that had brought her to his door. She hadn't asked him again if he was sure. She didn't need to. The answer was already in everything he'd done since opening that door. We can reach the high caves before nightfall, Thorn said without turning. There's water, old fire pits, and if we're lucky, snowberries still in season. She smiled faintly. My people once called that place Widow's Pass. It's where the last of our women and children hid when the bluecoats came. Then it's where we'll go, he replied. He glanced back at the cabin one last time. The walls that once kept the world out now looked too small to contain what he'd become. Every board whispered of the man who'd come here to vanish. But he wasn't vanishing anymore. He was choosing. Ayanna stepped beside him, her presence no longer foreign. It felt like something familiar, like a story he'd once heard in another life and had finally remembered. She touched his arm lightly. You don't have to keep going with me. Thorn met her gaze. You think I'm doing this for you? A long pause. Then she shook her head. No, I think you're doing it for who you used to be, and maybe for who you still could become. He didn't answer. He didn't need to. Instead, he helped her mount, then swung into the saddle beside her. The horses turned as one, and they rode west into the shimmering heat, into silence, into a future that hadn't been written yet. Behind them, the cabin stood empty, save for dried blood and echoes. But ahead the mountains waited. Two souls once lost. Now not alone.